All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Liz Reynolds, for those of you I don't know. I think I know many of you. It's really great to be here. This is the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, and we have quite the special evening planned. Before I begin in earnest, I would like to just note that this evening was co-created by a large group of us. I just want to read our names together. It was a real collaborative effort, a real honor to work with all of us coming together. So in addition to myself, Susan Kaufman, Bill DuPont, Mimi Hunt, Mary Louise Kelly, Ed Spellman, Dan Zisk, Linda Fanning, and Bev Wan all participated in creating this event tonight. This is a Racial Affinity Group collective wisdom sharing. And I want to start out tonight with our collective intentions for this evening, the ones that we came up with as a brainstorming session together. So our first intention is really answering questions of why do we, as a predominantly white-bodied sangha, engage in racial affinity group work? How is this work transformational to our practices? And yeah, why do we do it? Our second intention is wanting to acknowledge the work that we have done as a sangha, how this work is lived out in community, and also acknowledging the immense journey that is still before us in creating belonging here. Our last intention involves integrating this work into the larger sangha. For many of us, this racial awakening work is a focal point of our spiritual practice, and we'd like that to be shared in the larger community. So to give you a brief schedule of the evening's events, we'll have a short sit, 5 minutes or so to kind of settle in as we begin. And then I'll be giving some context for our work, both the racial context of Buddhism, American Buddhism, and also our work here as a sangha over the last decade. And then we'll get to move into our speaker sharing. We have 7 speakers lined up tonight, and they will each share briefly about their experience as members of racial affinity groups. We'll then have some time in breakout groups to share collectively about what's resonated for us about the evening. And then we'll end with, depending on time, a shorter or longer sit with some guidance from Ruth King, who's been a mentor of this work. So I'm really excited for this evening, really grateful to have everyone here. And we will start to settle in. So if you'd like to find a position for this body, and this will just be a 5-minute or so time of arriving. And so we might begin by noticing how this body has arrived in relationship with the earth that is supporting us. Noticing the settlings in this body that are possible. And there's this idea that instead of a passive force, the earth beneath us is actually rising up to meet and support this body. There might be an idea that the earth is encouraging us to settle, encouraging the legs to rest against the support. And allowing for this sense of rest and settling as we take a few minutes of silent meditation together. Thank you, everyone. So I'll be giving us just a brief context for this work, for this evening, but also a bit of the broader racial context of American Buddhism. As we are all aware, I'm sure, but it still bears repeating, the Buddha was an Asian contemplative. He was born and taught and died in what we now know as Asia. And for centuries, his teachings were passed down and safeguarded by groups of Asian contemplatives. I mention this not to be pedantic, but instead to remind us that we are practicing in a context that is larger than ourselves and that is truly global. those of us here today have a really profound opportunity to offer gratitude to these long lineages of Asian contemplatives, including Chinese Buddhists, Japanese Buddhists, Tibetan, Thai, Vietnamese Buddhists, among many others. And I mention this especially because for the past 40 or 50 years in this country, a popular face of American Buddhism has been a white face. And so it bears repeating and perhaps reiterating that since the beginnings of this country and still to this day, the majority of American Buddhists are Asian American. The first practicing Buddhists arrived to this country as Chinese workers in the mid-1800s to Hawaii and the West Coast, and Japanese Buddhists followed in the 1880s. So I mention this briefly because questions of power and privilege and identity are not separate, of course, from our identity as Americans. And those same questions of power, privilege, and identity are also not separate from our spiritual practices. Here at IMCC, the inquiry into racial identity of our Sangha began around 2012. This initiative was led by Christina Weaver, Teresa Miller, Sharon Beckman-Brindley, Jeff Frazier, and others. Between 2013 and 2014, we had the privilege of hosting 3 Mindful of Race workshops led by the very talented and gifted Ruth King. And I'd like to take a moment here to emphasize the really profound mentorship and wisdom that Ruth King has offered this Sangha. Not just our Sangha, but our country, really, at this intersection of racial awareness and spiritual practice. Ruth not only wrote this book, in case anyone here hasn't heard of it, Mindful of Race, but she was also really crucial in us and our development of racial affinity groups as a place to begin this inquiry for our Sangha. At that time, and still to this day, our Sangha has questions about our mostly white-bodied membership, mostly unanswered questions. We would really and truly like our Sangha to be a place where folks from all races, folks of all sexual orientations, of all ability levels, can feel a deeper sense of belonging. And so we continue to work on these inquiries. In 2015, the first white racial affinity group began. And I'd like to pause here and spend a few seconds talking about the what, why, and how of racial affinity groups, especially those for white folks. As Ruth outlines in her book, it's quite common for white folks like myself to move through life with very little awareness of our race. We mostly see ourselves as individuals instead of as a collective, a white racialized group, a group that holds very real power and privilege and resources. So because I can't say it better than Ruth herself, I'm going to read an excerpt from her book about racial affinity groups and why we put ourselves in these groups. So she writes, in racial affinity groups, we put ourselves in intentional spaces with people of our same race, where we can be safe enough to be vulnerable, challenged, and unedited. To examine the stories we have been told and the stories we tell ourselves. To lean toward what is unfamiliar and away from what is habitual. And to understand what is difficult to acknowledge, feel, and attend to within us and among us as a racial group. In a racial affinity group for white people, They can discover together their group identity. They can cultivate racial solidarity and compassion and support each other in sitting with the discomfort, confusion, and numbness that often accompany white racial awakening. They can also discern white privilege and its impact without the aid of or dependence on people of color. White people who have formed racial affinity groups report that they recognized their collective commonality and shared history, as well as the impact that their privilege has had on other races and on each racial affinity group member. While many people of color may not need an affinity group to help them relate to their racial group membership, they may need to explore the diversity that exists among people of color and across people of color without the distraction of having to educate white people on whiteness and its harm. A habitual focus on white people can distract people of color from knowing themselves as a diverse body. Exploring this tender territory in a racial affinity group can be a wholesome alternative to expecting white people at large, who often are not aware of being racial beings, to relieve the intense distress experienced by people of color. So again, a huge thanks to Ruth for her guidance and leadership. To date, IMCC has had and sponsored 9 racial affinity groups, so far all for white-bodied folks. Currently, we have 7 groups in existence. All are run by IMCC volunteer facilitators. And in all, we have had 74 participants, either currently or in the past. Ruth King continues to be a mentor for our Sangha. She was a consultant for us in 2020 and 2021 for our facilitators. And this past year, 8 of us facilitators have been members of Ruth's first cohort in her Racial Affinity Group development program, which ends next month. So that's just a brief history of where we have been, where we are. And I'd like to take a few minutes to really acknowledge the facilitators, both past and present, of our groups. They've put in an enormous amount of work and time and energy, and many of them are here tonight. So if we were in person, I would ask them to stand. Since we're not in person, I wonder if we'll all go to gallery view, if we can, so that we can see these folks, as I call their names. There are quite a few. So Racial Affinity Group facilitators past and present include Dan Zisk, Mimi Hunt, Susan Kaufman, Laura DeVault, Linda Fanning, Susan Stone, Phil DuPont, Barb Maley, Mary Louise Kelly, Ed Spellman, Bev Wan, Anna Van Hoy, and myself. So we would all applaud at this moment, but maybe we can do the Zoom applause or just send these folks some gratitude mentally. We really do appreciate all of y'all and thank you for your time. So we will now move into Racial Affinity Group member sharing. We have 7 folks lined up to offer their experiences tonight, 1 from each of the current Racial Affinity Groups. Each will share for approximately 2 to 3 minutes, I hope. And I'd like to offer a thought to those of us who are listening. And that thought is that this next portion is a really rich opportunity to practice this idea of internal and external mindfulness. After each speaker shares, we'll be taking a brief pause of 30 seconds or so. And that's really a time for you to come back into your body. Notice what the body is telling us. Notice what the heart is telling us. Also notice what the mind is telling us. That will probably be apparent. And then there is this opportunity to maintain some connection to our bodies as we're listening, also paying attention to this external source of our speakers. So our first speaker tonight is Pat Coffey. And unfortunately, Pat wasn't able to be here this evening. So he's recorded a short video for us. And I'm glad I'm not hosting. Judy's going to do that for us. Thank you, Judy.
Hello there. I just want to spend a couple of minutes and talk to you about this concept that you've heard at IMCC, bridging separation. I mean, what does it mean, really? Well, frankly, it's foundational to contemplative practice. We are endeavoring in all these various practices to close the gap that we feel between ourselves and other. Other could be the environment, the biosphere. Other could be issues around race, around gender, around sexual orientation, around class, around political affiliation, around disability. And maybe primary is the exploration of fragmentation internally. Looking at the difficult emotions, looking at the woundings that we've had, and finding ways to bring compassion, acceptance, love to ourself. And also working externally. And so in IMCC, we've chosen to really specifically look at race over the last half dozen years or more now. And whenever we focus on a particular area and look at where the contractions are, where the resistance is, and find ways to work across that, any kind of bridging has a tendency to transfer in other areas. We learn how to do it. We know that when we're contracting, what do? We notice it. Our awareness shows it to us. And we find ways to bridge that, to understand ourselves and to bridge that. So this idea of bridging separation, it's fundamental. It's really spiritual work or contemplative work at its most basic. So you're going to hear that phrase often, and I hope that you can find ways to understand more deeply the fragmentations within and work to heal there, and the fragmentations without. A kind of collapsing of a dualistic perspective, subject and object. There's more of a bridging such that there is a oneness, an intimacy with all of creation. So thank you much.
So we'll perhaps all thank Pat mentally. We'll take our short pause to reconnect with ourselves. And our next speaker for the evening will be Kathy Sparr. Kathy, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. I'm glad to be here. and share what my experience has been. I joined a racial affinity group back in 2017, and I had the good fortune to be in a group that Susan Stone facilitated, and I'm glad to see she's here tonight. During that year together, Susan gently but firmly guided us not only to share our ideas and experiences, but to explore our feelings about what we were learning and experiencing. I guess you could say this is a mindful practice of bridging head and heart. That took each of us time and work, and at the end of the year, our group felt it had just gotten started, and we wanted to continue. Sadly, Susan had to step away, but Linda Fanning, who's here tonight, has graciously held the space for us to continue the work, and we've been at it ever since, welcoming other new members along the way. So what have we learned over 4.5 years? We spoke about this at a recent gathering, and we all agreed that we see ourselves and our world through a very different lens than before. It's been surprising and painful to read, listen, and learn just how much we as white people don't know, and maybe don't want to know about our own history as white Americans, and also how much of our history has been hidden, neglected, or interpreted to do racial harm. Another uncomfortable truth is that we've been conditioned to identify ourselves more as individuals, as Liz said earlier, and not as members of a white racial group. Therefore, it's easy not to see how being white gives us certain privileges and advantages, including the privilege of not knowing or caring about the collective impact we have on other races. It perpetuates what Ruth King calls group habits of racial harm. By sharing our racial biographies, we've been able to trace how the advantages of being white have played out in our family histories and in each of our lives. We've discovered many uncomfortable and painful things, but seeing what is true is powerful and necessary for racial healing to take place. It's been a place to share these truths, acknowledge them, and continue the work of forgiveness and healing, especially through the practice of loving kindness. Over the years, this meta practice has become central for me in doing this work. I return again and again to Ruth King's invitation to change racism from the inside out. And I do this in part by opening or softening my heart to kindness and forgiveness for myself and others, forgiveness for the violence and injustice of past and present history, and most challenging of all, offering kindness and goodwill sometimes towards those whose minds and hearts are clouded by prejudice or ignorance that does harm. On good days, I see these challenging folks as teachers. What can I learn from them and about them and myself in each moment? This is the steady practice of bridging head and heart. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathy. We'll pause. Our next speaker this evening is Ed Spellman. Ed, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, everybody. So when I agreed to join a racial affinity group, I didn't have any expectations beyond maybe gaining a more robust understanding of race and what it means for me personally. What I actually gained can't be stated in the time I've been given, but I'll give it a try. I believe that I have been transformed in many ways with guidance and help from my dear friends in our group, I can now see that I actually belong to a race, and that race has a long and complicated history that can be difficult to talk about. I also know that when there's conversations about race, it does include me. My silence and blindness doesn't work anymore. I've had many aha moments over the past 5+ years that have reshaped how I see my place as a white male. I've learned about my privilege, and I've looked into the doors that privilege has opened for me. I've looked honestly into my family history and my past to discover experiences that I've long since ignored or forgotten, but I can now point to as critical moments that shaped my beliefs and shaped my preconceived notions about race. I know that I've caused people pain, and it pains me to realize that. I know that as a white-bodied person, I have a responsibility to continue to be curious about my complicity in matters of race. I cherish my time in this group because I am now more aware in body, mind, and heart of the impact that my white-bodied presence can have in any situation and in any moment. My identity is forever changed by my participation in our group. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We'll take a minute of silence here. Our next speaker this evening is Shannon McNett. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you, Liz. Hello, everyone. As I've taken some time to reflect on my experience this past year with my group of 8 white women, what really stood out to me every time was just a sense of greater connection. I really feel like that's the biggest piece for me. You know, a greater connection with the women in the group, and then with white people in general, and then also just all around it. I've often had experiences when I talk about race with white people that I immediately start to feel very separated and irritated or upset. And so it was really beautiful to be able to be in this space where, there was really an honoring around how it was done, and so much respect. And so it was just very special. It was really amazing to hear these different stories of these different members that were all, so different than me, and with such, different viewpoints, and just to feel a connection with them and their experience and our shared intention together. There was a lot of pain that was shared, which I expected that there would be. And that was really important to hear and to feel. But I think what was most surprising to me was the really intense moments of joy that really was a shared, I mean, I feel comfortable saying was a really shared sense in our group. Some of the couple of moments of just laughter that came from our group was just so shocking to me, because it felt like a more intense laugh than I've, like the kind of laugh you can't have around your family who you know. Just this, like, we've all just met and this is just so deeply, you know, I would come upstairs after at least one group and my husband was just like, what were you doing? Like, that's what was going on. Isn't that your racial affinity group? And that was shocking to me, because I've only mostly felt, you know, a lot of pain when I think about my whiteness and things I've done, things, you know, white people have done and still do. But I think there was just something really special to the sense that there can be more in there for me, and that it's just so complex, you know, just to kind of lean into those moments with really sharing an intention with people in a special way. That there can be a range of things happening. In terms of just my interactions, I definitely feel like a bit of a softening for me, you know, during the group and since being in there, which has been really wonderful. And my interactions, the social justice opportunities, and softening doesn't mean not still, you know, seeing what's there, but for me, it feels like a little bit more helpful. And I've also noticed with my Dharma work that I've had just more of an interest in leaning into my loving kindness practice, which has been really just curious for me. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And our next speaker tonight is Philip DuPont. Phil, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to share, and it reminds me that that's really what the RAG groups are about, is sharing our experiences and perceptions, being vulnerable, being open, being receptive. And I'm reminded of the experience of feeling profoundly heard by other people, because a component of the group is that we each speak without crosstalk. So everyone has a chance, everyone is fully heard. I've been a member of 3 different groups, 2 of which are still active, one of which is a white male racial affinity group, which just feels like a new experience every time we meet. We're in our 2nd year. I think what's been most significant to me is recognizing what I didn't know about myself and my white experience, and even recognizing and learning that I was having a white experience. Thinking about my whiteness, and by extension, white privilege, And then there's the extension of white male privilege. It's all worthy of exploration and tenderness. Being a member of a racial affinity group has added what I would think of as a dimension to my meditation practice and my study of Buddhism. It allows me to have another point of comparison and perspective on what I'm learning and experiencing. So it's been very opening. There's been a positive impact on my professional life, I think. I'm much more tuned in to what Ruth calls the hindrance of intention and impact. That as a white person and a good white person, I have certain intentions, but may not recognize the impact that I'm having. And I see that happening in interactions and relationships between all of us. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. So our next speaker this evening is Lisa Targonsky. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. I initially had some hesitancy in discussing race solely with people that look a lot like me, but I came to really enjoy my time with the Racial Affinity Group, and I'll just talk about it a little bit from the head, the heart, and the feet perspective. So in my head, participating in our Racial Affinity Group has strengthened my foundation of knowledge on how we as white people often present ourselves on the topic of race. I've learned that we're not alone in this journey to understand race and racial relations, to reflect on our missteps and outright wrongs, and to contribute our efforts to a more just future. I've learned that we all come to this space with different experiences, different perspectives, and different contributions to share with one another. And I've learned the power of a group of people pausing. From the heart, hearing some of the group members' journeys and inner thoughts on the topic of race has helped me keep a more open heart with white strangers I encounter. Sitting with and sharing the discomfort of experiences and concerns amongst our group members has taught me that burdens can be eased if we are willing to carry them together. And I found the community of the Racial Affinity Group in a community of Charlottesville that's been perplexing at times. And from the perspective of my feet in action, it's not come easily, but I've taken what I learned in the Racial Affinity Group, the pause, the hindrances, the recognition that there exist good people with good intent on a journey of compassion, to my discussions on race in other spaces. It's a work in progress. I'm a work in progress, but I've been able to bring more compassion to discussions on race with my family and coworkers. I grumble at the TV and social media a little less and take steps towards meeting people where they're at a little more easily in hopes that I can walk alongside them on a shared journey towards a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So I am our final speaker this evening. I will introduce myself. I'm Liz. I first became aware of race consciously when I was 19 or 20. I was a sophomore in college, took some classes on the sociology of race. And in those classes, learning about the vast inequities of our country based on race, I encountered emotions like overwhelm, shame, guilt, really deep sadness. But I was 19 in college, and all of those emotions were way too much for me to process or even really understand on my own. So I threw myself into volunteer activities that I can now see were mostly motivated by wanting to fix or solve this problem of racism so that I wouldn't have to really face those emotions. I can see now what I really didn't see then, that my body and my unconscious knew very clearly that many of my ancestors had enslaved human beings. In those early years of racial awakening, I was trying very, very hard to escape the difficulty of that reckoning with myself, reckoning with the legacy of my ancestors, and reckoning with the history of this country and my place in the history of this country. So fast forward 15 years, I'm now 34, and spiritual practice has been at the center of my life for over a decade. Racial awakening work has been a focal point of that spiritual practice for the last 5 years. And I don't have anything magical to offer this evening. There is no magic bullet, no quick fix or solution. What I have learned, and what so many of us tonight have also shared, what I feel in my body is a softening. A number of us have used that word, which we didn't plan that ahead of time. I have felt softening towards myself as a very fallible but also precious being. I've felt softening towards all of us beings, and that is every single human being in this country who suffers really greatly as a result of the separation caused by racial conditioning. In that softening and with that softening, for me, there has been an ability to hold more. I'm able to hold more difficulty, more difficult emotions. I'm also able to hold deeper understanding and a deeper connection to what is true, which is something a number of us have mentioned tonight as well. Thank you. I want to thank everyone, all of our speakers and sharers tonight, very sincerely. Thank you for your time and your courage. We have 15 minutes left tonight, and we're going to use that mostly to sit. Before we begin kind of a meditation, though, I do want to mention that there is always the potential to form a new racial affinity group, depending on interest in the Sangha. Judy's going to put her IMCC email address in the chat box. That's who you would contact if you were interested in joining a group. If we have enough interest, we'll be in touch, and hope that there is interest. This work can be transformational, I think we've established tonight. So we did not have a meditation tonight formally, so we are going to end with one. There will be some time after we kind of formally end our evening together at 8:30 if folks want to comment or ask more questions. But I do think a meditation would be a nice way to end this evening. So I invite everybody to settle in to your spots, your place on this earth. And as we are reminded once more of our place, our connection to this earth, the support that the ground offers, we might welcome the idea that this earth that is below us is connecting all of us here tonight. We are all resting upon the same earth. This earth is connecting us to all contemplatives in this world. It is the same earth. And this earth is connecting all beings, whether human beings in our racialized bodies, animal beings, tree beings, rock beings. We might open up to a sense of gratitude to this earth for supporting us, and a sense of gratitude to this earth for connecting us. Across time and space to all of these beings. We'll take some moments of silent, collective meditation. And I'll close our time together after these minutes of silence with a guided metta meditation from our teacher, Ruth King. And as we close our time together this evening, these words from Ruth King. Don't be afraid of getting your heart broken. Do your work, say your prayers, then do your best. Grieve, rest, keep hate at bay, and join with others for refuge. Don't get too far ahead of now. This moment is enough to digest. Sit, breathe, open. Don't be a stranger to moments of freedom that may be flirting with you. Allow racial distress to teach you how to be more human. Sit in the heat of it until your heart is both warmed and informed. Then make a conscious choice to be a light. May our thoughts and actions reflect the world we want to live in and leave behind. May we heal the seeds of separation inherited from our ancestors in gratitude for this life. May all beings without exception benefit from our growing awareness. May our thoughts and actions be ceremonies of well-being for all races. May we honor being diverse racial beings among the human race and beyond race. May we meet the racial cries of the world with as much wisdom and grace as we can muster. Thank you, Sangha. It's been a pleasure to be with you this evening.